There's different ways to approach education and catechetics and discipleship building. And certainly there's a need to be mindful of the audience, so more of the receiver. But at the same time, I like to kind of push people. And I was talking about it with one of the staff members at the office at my parish, and he brought to my attention this really great quote by this American actor and writer, Del Close. And basically what he said was, if you treat your audience like poets and geniuses, they will become that. If you treat your audience like poets and geniuses, they will become that. And I like to think it's not necessarily even my personal bent. I think that's the way of the Lord. Throughout the course of the gospel, Jesus believes in people more than they believe in themselves. And so a lot of times we kind of examine ourselves, we examine our wounded hearts. A lot of times all we see are our own frailties and weaknesses and failings and stuff. And we have a certain apprehension about the future based on what we have done or failed to do in the past. Whereas here's the Lord who was like, look, I've always seen you a certain way. Not just you are the beloved sons and daughters of Christ the King, but I see who you could become. And I'm committed to help you become that particular person. So I guess I want to begin by talking about that. Just like the look of the Lord. So obviously Jesus is God. And so the way he looks at people, it's reminiscent of God the Father when he creates the world, when he creates the universe. So you see time and time again, God the Father looks upon his creation and sees that it is good. The Lord does something similar. So he steps into the shoes of the Creator God. I look upon someone who is wounded, sick, struggling with physical stuff, struggling with sin. I have a desire to heal you, but at the same time, I see you in your wholeness. You as you are, but also, again, who you could become. Fully human, fully alive. This really comes through in this really famous passage where basically the Lord and his disciples, they spent the entire past day doing their thing, teaching and healing and casting out demons, and now they're tired. And so they want to take time away from the crowd to rest and eat some stuff, have a nap. But you remember what happens. So they go into a boat, they go to the other side, and then the people know they're going to the other side, so they rush to the other side. And Jesus sees them. He looks at them. They're harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. And so, even though he's tired, even though there's stress, even though I deserve time off because I've worked all day really, really hard, I forget myself, and I teach them many things. And you get the sense it's not so much like, I want to teach you intellectual concepts about the faith. Here are things I want to teach you, which will actually make your life better. And you get the sense it's not just like one thing or two things. Like I feel compassion, right? My heart breaks when I see you in your plight, and so I want to give you and teach you many things. You see this actually in the original Greek. So instead of harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd, what you hear is he looks at them and they're mangled and cast away like sheep without a shepherd. Here are the people of God, the holy people of God, the kingly people of God, the children of Christ. And they're mangled and cast away, harassed and helpless. People don't care. They haven't cared for a long time. And here's the long-awaited Messiah, the shepherd, God the Father. Yeah, I want to teach you many things. Now, if you have clarity about that, it helps to frame what the mission is. Like we talked about this the other day, right? The mission of the church is to make disciples of all nations. The mission of the Holy Catholic Church is to make disciples of all nations, in service of which is the going and the baptizing and the teaching. The Great Commission, right? To make other Christs in this world, beginning with ourselves. Now, the thing I want to do tonight is kind of flesh that out. Because you can hear that and think, well, okay, I guess that sounds intellectually correct, but doesn't sound super exciting. Okay, Christ wants more followers. I guess that sounds like the right answer. Do I want that for myself? Do I want that for other people? But when you situate it in terms of what I just said, harassed and helpless, mangled and cast away, it's like, oh, this makes more sense. What does Christ want for us when he looks at us? To be fully alive. Everywhere where you're not fully yourself, where you experience fear and brokenness and the captivity of sin, I want to reach you in all those different places until you're fully healed and fully alive. Before my current assignment, I had 2 assignments actually. I was pastor of St. Joseph the Worker Parish in Oshawa, but I was also priest chaplain of Ontario Tech, Durham College, and Trent. And I remember in the early going what we did was something which, in retrospect, was a terrible idea. It's something that people do all the time. So what we did, we started these little groups, and we called them discipleship groups. And they were basically vehicles to form kids of college and university age. And so basically we had these recurring groups. We met at a certain time in the church. People will come, we'll teach them, they'll become disciples. That's the reason why it's called a discipleship group. And no one came, except for 2 people. I think one guy was forced to go because of his dad. Now, what do people typically say? Well, it's not about the numbers. Kind of is. Right? If you run this thing week after week and like nobody comes, it's like, wait a minute, there's something wrong with our process. And so we had to think about it. What do we have to do? There was a book I read around the same time which was massively influential, called Forming Intentional Disciples by Sherry Waddell. And basically the thesis of her book was, you can't skip steps. Yes, the goal is to make disciples of all nations, beginning with yourself, right? But a lot of times we jump the gun, like I did when I was chaplain, just starting off. So what she does, she cites a bunch of different steps leading to intentional discipleship. So I'm going to walk you through these things one step at a time. First of all, she says, it's really important to establish trust. Father John Ricardo, I remember once he was talking about the decision to join a church. And he said, you know what? The only reason why you should join a church is because what they teach is true. You shouldn't join a church because people are nice, because people smile, or because people are friendly. I agree with all that. That said, be nice. Right? This is what St. Paul means when he talks about being all things to all men. He's not saying stretch yourself thin or do too many things as a result of which you are physically and spiritually dissipated. What he's getting at is don't let the sharp edges of your personality get in the way of people receiving the gospel. That's part of the reason why seminary formation is so long. We're not just sitting around memorizing the Bible. We're kind of messed up. And so what's happening, there's spiritual formation, but also a lot of human formation. Because what happens if you're a priest, if you're anyone on the front lines of ministry, you encounter a whole variety of different situations, different people, different circumstances. If you have buttons to push, or you're triggered by any kind of difficult circumstance, you're going to find out. And so the goal is like, okay, hopefully over the course of, for example, seminary formation, a lot of these things are weeded out. The example that comes to mind, we took this course, a bunch of priests from the Archdiocese of Toronto, called Good Leaders, Good Shepherds. It was really pushed by Cardinal Collins. And basically, it was an organizational behavior course which took place over a series of months to teach diocesan priests how to bring to the table organizational behavioral principles for the good of the parish. And they had different modules. The module which was everyone's favorite was this notion of leadership with regards to yourself. And so basically it began with all of us taking personality tests. And so basically in terms of my personality, apparently I'm introverted and controlling. And that has pros and cons. Basically what they say is like regardless of your personality set, there's certain things which come naturally to you, certain things that you struggle with, pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses. So for example, with my particular personality, if people use what I feel to be too many words to explain a simple concept, I have to resist the temptation to write them off forever. You find other personalities, for example, which are extroverted and controlling. Well, obviously the solution is this. Obviously the thing to do is that, and they don't follow good process. They don't ask people's opinion because obviously the solution, again, is this as opposed to that. Here's the point though. In the course, basically what they taught us was the importance of having a clear value set. The importance of having a clear value set. So the whole point is this. Everyone has their own unique personality. And with that, pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses. But if you have a clear value set, you can rise above your predisposed way of acting in a certain way in a given situation because this is what I value. And it won't feel like you're suppressing yourself in an unhealthy sort of way because, no, I have clarity. This is what I really want. Even though there's a part of me that wants to do this, I can choose to say no to that because I have clarity about the greater yes. So one of the things they did, they said, okay, examine yourself. There's a bunch of good values, but what's something you value a lot yourself? Like name a bunch of values and then define those values. And basically just to kind of paraphrase, I was a little surprised by this. What I discovered about myself is that it's really important to me to facilitate an encounter between the holy people of God and God himself. It goes to the notion of priesthood. It goes with every vocation, but basically when you're a priest, one of the toughest things to do is to develop a certain clarity as to what does it mean to be a priest. There's a bunch of right answers, but there's a certain type of answer which gets you up in the morning. So a priest is one who offers sacrifice, I guess. A priest is the one who is mediator, meant to be a mediator between God and his people, I suppose. But again, this notion of facilitating an encounter between God and his people, yeah, I can get up for that. I'll give my life for that. And more to the point, when I was doing this exercise and defining these different values, I discovered that, you know what? Something I really believe in is facilitating an encounter between God and his people through joy. It's tough to convey the joy of the gospel when you're a sourpuss, when you're caught up in your own ego and self-pity and pride. Like we know this from experience. We know this from observing other people. We have enough gloomy saints, if you will. Once I had that clear in the back of my mind, it was easy to kind of say no to all sorts of things I might be inclined to do. So how it plays out in real time, it's like I have no room for fear or self-pity or shame or the lesser good because my job, my life is dedicated to bringing people closer to Christ. And that's the sort of clarity you need to have when it comes to evangelization. It goes to the notion of what we might call remote preparation and the immediate thing. It goes to this notion of like remote preparation on the one hand and the immediate circumstance. I remember talking to a young mom a long time ago, and she was anticipating a really difficult conversation with her kid. I forget how old the kid was, maybe like early 20s or something. And so she was anticipating a difficult conversation about a really challenging topic. And so she came to me and said, well, here's the topic, here's kind of what my kid is like, what saith you? And I said, well, you know what? Here's like 15 books on that topic, and you should read it. So you have flexibility. And she was like, oh no. She wasn't expecting that, right? This is remote preparation. Like, I don't know your kid. I don't know what he's going to say. And the issue that you're concerned about, yeah, I'm pretty sure he's going to raise that. I don't know when. I don't know what aspect of that particular issue. I don't know how much time you're going to have. And so therefore, you need to have $1 million in the bank so you can spend 10 cents at a time. Flexibility. But going back to our original point, this notion of trust. Even though it's true, the only reason why people should join a church is because what they teach is true. At the same time, be nice, be welcoming, be open. so that the sharp edges of your personality don't constitute an obstacle. Now, we can take it one step further. I remember attending a conference in Dallas, Texas. It was about vocations, but also it was for seminary formators. So it wasn't just about how to get people into seminary. It's like, how do we form these guys to become happy, healthy, holy priests? And one speaker, he said, obviously guys who enter the seminary, they're from the world. And the world, obviously, a ton of stuff going on, a lot of stuff not going on. You think about broken families, pornography, whatever the case may be. Guys are coming from this particular culture, and so they have also a broken and wounded heart. But instead of simply kind of concluding, well, what are you going to do? We try our best. He had actually a really particular solution. And so he said, when you look at the gospel, there are clearly moments where Jesus teaches people in a lecture format. Think about the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, the Our Father. So a lecture format. But if you read between the lines, he's just hanging out with these guys. He's just hanging out with the disciples. And that's why there's a joke apparently amongst biblical scholars. If you look at the gospel, Jesus and his disciples, they're either going to a meal or having a meal or leaving a meal to go to their next meal. Right? And the whole point is that none of that is wasted time. There's this really notable philosopher, basically what she says is love equals time plus attention. Love equals time plus attention. On the face of it, it seems like you're just kind of like wasting time, but isn't that the nature of friendship? It's not about functionality or efficiency or productivity, or I need you to become something so I feel better about myself. My friend, by definition, is useless, right? But in the best sort of way. So I waste time with my friend. Bishop Barron talks about this, right? So certainly in life, there's a bunch of reasons why we might engage in useful endeavors. My car is broken, I fix the car so I can drive the car, so I can go to this particular place. But ultimately, we do useful things to be useless with useless people, because that's the nature of love. If I don't have that as a habitual thing I have in my life, I've forgotten how to be human. I remember talking to someone once in a parish setting, and basically they were lamenting the lack of parish volunteers. Why won't people step up? Why won't people volunteer? I ask people to volunteer and they don't step up, and I'm frustrated by that. The people of God, right? And we talked about it, and it's like, you know what? You should focus on being friends with the people of God. Because I think you're moving way too fast. I don't know these people beyond like their names and their email addresses, and so I just asked them to do this thing to make my life easier. Like, that's kind of messed up. Again, I think back to that Good Leaders, Good Shepherds course. They were talking about leadership. They defined leadership. I won't give you the comprehensive definition, but I remember there was a part of the definition which was familiar, and another part not so much. And so one part was like, well, leadership allows you to do things that you couldn't do by yourself. Everyone knows that. That's pretty simple. But then the other part of the definition, which was kind of surprising and almost a little bit shocking, was like, look, it's very important as the leader that you figure out what people desire. What do they like? What do they love? What do they long for? And to figure out ways to satisfy that deep longing. And you're like, what does that have to do with leadership? Everything. Whenever you look at the parables of Christ, there's a lot of parables where there's like workers and vineyards. I don't know if you ever noticed this. This always struck me. When it comes to the end of those parables, you realize it wasn't really about the vineyard. It wasn't about productivity. Basically, the Lord set up these circumstances to reveal that which was always in the hearts. But so it goes with us. It's not really about productivity. I produce a lot of stuff, therefore I enter into the kingdom of heaven. It's not about that. So we have these things that we do individually and collectively, but the idea is that we're helping each other to grow more like Christ by creating these opportunities to love each other, to be the helper but also to be the helpee. So going back to the story, what I said to this person was like, look, I would just, again, focus on being friends with people. Just hang out. Not even as a secret, like, oh, one day I'll ask you for something. Like, don't be like the Godfather, right? But just a sense of like, you really are my friend. And going back to the gospel, that's the way of Christ. So I give you copious amounts of like time and attention to the point at which you believe in my love. And you believe in my love because we hang out all the time. I've seen you at your best, I've seen you at your worst, and I'm always with you. The nature of friendship. And therefore, I will receive the difficult truth from you, where I might not receive it from someone else, because I believe in your love, because you've given me time and attention. I remember when I was in law school, there was a friend of mine who was like, hey, you seem pretty good at talking to people. I have a nephew who seems to be going through something. Why don't you come over and, talk about his thing? And I think she expected that we would meet up, and immediately I'd be like, so what's your deep, dark secret? Let's talk about that. So what happened was, I arranged it so that the three of us went to dinner. We had the full shebang, appetizer, entree, dessert, coffee, and stuff. And then we went back to her place, and the whole time I'm not bringing up anything. And the after party is always really important. And then at the very end, he raised this thing, but not before. And I could tell the whole time my friend was like, are we going to do this thing or what? But you see the point, right? Like, he had to bring it up when he was ready. And if it wasn't going to happen that night, it wasn't going to happen that night. But he didn't know me. And so he had to be convinced, or he had to believe that I was interested in him. And once you feel secure, once you feel safe, all sorts of possibilities. So going back to the chaplaincy thing, we had that disastrous period where we did the discipleship groups, but then we changed it up. So what we did, basically we decided to revamp one of the rooms in the church. You can see this online. The whole idea was, okay, we have a lot of people in the parish who are very handy, and they're willing to volunteer their time because they're very generous. So we asked the Archdiocese for like $20,000, and they gave it to us. And basically, we revamped this one room to make it what I would like to call an intentional welcoming space. It's interesting, when it comes to architecture and the way our churches are set up, we tend to have a lot of meeting spaces, but not a lot of intentional welcoming spaces. So a lot of times we have meetings in these rooms where you can't wait for the meeting to be over. The meeting's over, gosh, now I can leave this disgusting room, right? And so we thought, why don't we create a room which is beautiful, that people like to be in, which makes them feel comfortable, which makes them feel safe. So a certain thematic consistency. So I remember we were picking colors, for example, and someone said, well, why don't we pick like gray or like white? And it's like, not in your life. And so we picked red. And we had a nice barn board wall, TV, hardwood floors, different lighting, lending library, a little coffee station. And basically what would happen is that at the end of the Saturday night Mass, everyone would go into this intentional welcoming space. And we didn't teach them anything. It was just come and just hang out. We had people make food for the kids, and so it had that communal potluck aspect, and rinse and repeat. We just did that like every single week for like months. So Mass, sometimes preceded by confession, leading to this time of fellowship with other kids from college. Again, rinse and repeat. Now what happened, that developed a really good vibe. And so after a while, it's like, wait a minute, like, I feel good, I feel safe. And I had this sense of security and safety and fellowship and friendship associated with the structure of the church. And that was worth a ton. And so once they felt comfortable, once they felt safe, it's like, hey, you know what? We're going to go to this retreat. And everyone went. Now we're going to go to this conference. And everyone went. Now we're going to go to this come and see weekend to discern the possible vocations of the priesthood. And they went too. And basically, from that situation, we had 3 guys enter the seminary because we didn't skip steps. It's amazing what you can do when people actually like you. So the importance of trust. Now, the second thing that Sherry Waddell talks about, she talks about curiosity. It goes to this idea that when you're building trust, it's not simply like, I hope that you like me and feel safe in my presence. Somehow you have to be convinced that I'm happy, and the reason why I'm happy has something to do with Christ. When I first came to my current parish, one of my first priorities was to find a really good barber, which was hard, because I'm in the country. And I remember going to this one place, and the guy wasn't Catholic, and he found out I was a priest. And at the end, he goes, you know what, I can't believe you're a priest. I'm like, why is that? He goes, because you're so funny. I'm like, that's not good. You can't be a priest because you're full of joy. That's quite bad, actually. It goes to this study I came across a long time ago. I guess it was a survey. And basically the survey was revealing that a big reason why people left the faith was because their home life was unhappy. It was like the number one reason. So I used to go to church, but now I don't. And why? Number one reason, when I look back, my home life was unhappy. And you're like, what's the connection there? Mom or dad might have said all the right things. But when I look at them, when I recall our family situation, they weren't happy. Somewhere along the way, I concluded that Jesus didn't or couldn't make them happy. And so they might have said all the right things, but what do kids pay attention to? Not what you say, but what you actually believe as revealed by how you live your life. It's a sobering thing. That's why, even though it sounds weird, it's really important to actually be happy. Not in a sort of like fake it sort of thing. I'm going to try to smile so people go to church. It's like, no, you actually have to have a sense of what it means to be happy and joyful and have peace in your heart because I know Jesus Christ. It's funny, when kids are young, they can be fooled in a certain sense, but when they get older, they can sniff out a fake. And if you lack integrity, if you don't have the sense of like, it's Jesus who makes me happy and gives me joy and peace, they will sniff that out a mile away, and eventually they'll kind of fall away. So it goes to this thing, curiosity, right? Building upon the notion of trust. I see something in you which is attractive and not forced. I heard this quote recently on a podcast. The thing which epitomizes the wise person waits to be asked a question. The funny way to put it is like the wise man on the mountain doesn't have to have a sign and saying, wise man on the mountain, talk to me. If you have this natural apostolic joy and sense of peace and recollection, people will see that and they'll have this natural curiosity. I want to know more. I want to get what you have. Now, obviously the question is like, what do you do in that particular circumstance? What comes to mind is flexibility. And it kind of goes to that thing we talked about earlier where I gave that young mother like 15 books. So a lot of times what happens when it comes to our apologetics game, how to explain different things with regards to the faith, we only know like one way. And that's not good. You need to know different ways. The quote that comes to mind, I think it was from G.K. Chesterton. Life is like a complex lock, and you need an equally complex key to unlock that lock. Really interesting stuff. And so basically, you think about, for example, not just kids, but like adults, the mystery and complexity of the human heart, all sorts of questions and desires and aspirations. And a lot of times what will happen is, I don't know, not just society, but like the church seems to give the impression, I have no room for the complexity of your heart. I'll give you an example. I remember once talking to this young kid, and he's like, yeah, I struggle with like anger, and I guess I gotta respect my parents more. And there was something about what he was saying. I was like, can you go back to that? Like, what's going on? And he said, well, basically what happens is like my parents, a lot of times, they'll just like leave without telling me. And I don't know how long they're gonna be gone. In the meantime, when they're gone, I get so scared. And then they come back, and I start yelling at them. And they say, hey, don't be angry. respect your parents. And you're like, oh, buddy. You see a variation of that when it comes to adults. I find in my own parish, I'm teaching people a lot about your emotional life. Maybe helpful for you as well. A lot of times when it comes to emotions, especially when it comes to unpleasant emotions, we don't know what to do with these things. So it's not even simply like, I feel sad, I feel angry, what do I do with that in terms of moving forward? I feel like, because I feel these things, and maybe even intensely, I'm a bad person. I think that's a common thing. I'm struggling with this thing. Someone hurt me. I feel angry. I'm going through a difficult, challenging thing with no immediate solution. I feel sad. I feel like on some level, God is disappointed by the fact that I'm angry or the fact that I'm sad. To the point of which, if people ask me, are you feeling sad? Are you feeling angry? Nope. No, what? I'm feeling great. I'll share with you a story. When I was on internship, my internship pastor, his room was across from my room, and our doors were open. And so I could see him, he could see me. And early on during internship, he came to me and he goes, Eric, something's bothering you. We should talk. And I'm like, nothing's bothering me. I don't want to talk. He's like, no, we'll talk later on. I'm like, okay. So later on, he's like, hey, we should talk. So he brought me in his room. I'm sitting in my chair. He's sitting in his chair. Okay, what? What's bothering you? And I'm like, nothing. He pressed it. Come on, what's bothering you? And it wasn't like I was trying to lie to him. Looking back on it, like, I was so used to being sad that in a certain sense I had given up hope. Like, what's the point of like even acknowledging this pain in my heart if there's no hope of even moving forward incrementally? To the point at which if someone asks me, are you upset? Are you sad? Are you hurt? Nothing. I like to think that's not an isolated case. I think people do that all the time. But God bless this guy. What he did, he kept on pushing, kept on asking questions. And after a while, it's like, oh gosh, like there is something. It's not just a little thing, it's a huge thing. Before you knew it, I was like ugly crying. And we talked about it for like hours. And I remember at the end, it was some variation of like, okay, I haven't completely solved this riddle in my heart, but I have just enough hope to move forward like one more step for tomorrow. Rinse and repeat. We had those conversations throughout the course of the year. And I needed every second of those conversations. And again, I don't think I'm alone in that. And if you have clarity about that, and you realize that's the common burden on the hearts of the people of God, you approach them way differently. That's why it drives me crazy when people speak in terms of empty platitudes. Something I think about all the time. In order for you to meet someone in their pain, you have to admit yourself in your pain first. And that's a scary thing. So again, I'm sad, I'm angry. First of all, to name it, what am I feeling? Why am I feeling that? And to work through it. In prayer, certainly, but also with people that you love, people that you trust, people in whose love you have confidence. And to take your time with it. It's not something which is healed right away. It's the nature of the wounded heart. It just takes a little bit of time, incrementally speaking. And I raise this really complex example with regards to curiosity, because if you have clarity that the human heart is complicated, and so therefore I approach the human heart with kid gloves, with a certain sensitivity to the complexity of this person's life, my gosh, it's a life-giving thing. Like that in itself is enormously life-giving, because you're not oversimplifying, you're not trying to be reductionist. I'm interested. I want to know the complexity of your story, and that creates all sorts of interesting opportunities. Next step is this notion of openness. I'm open to the possibility of changing or going the way of Christ. The example that comes to mind here, Christopher West. He writes a lot of great stuff about sexuality. And as a starting point, he talks about icons versus idols. And so basically what he says is that the Creator God is good, obviously. But what that means is that everything God creates is good. A participation in the good and the true and the beautiful, which means everything which exists is meant to be an icon of the invisible God, like a window which leads you to rejoice and rest in the glory which is God the Father. What happens, though, because of our fallen nature, we tend to kind of turn icons into idols. And so what happens, we become enamored with the window and we stop there, as opposed to passing through the window and resting again in the glory of the Creator God. And he uses the example of the prodigal son. I'm sure everyone's heard that story, but just to make sure we're on the same page. Here's his father, and he has two sons. One's younger and one's older. The younger son goes to the father, "Give me the share of the property owed to me." In other words, give me the inheritance. I don't care about you, I don't care about our relationship. Give me the money and just drop dead. Okay. He goes to a faraway land, loses his share of the property in loose living, prostitutes and whatnot. And then what happens, it's kind of interesting. A lot of people will look at this story and say, well, the prodigal son felt bad that he told his father to drop dead, and that's why he came back. No, not really. He says to himself, well, gosh, here I am starving, and my father's employees, his hired hands, his slaves, they have bread enough and to spare. I know, I will lie to my father. I'll go to my father, I'll say, oh, Father, I feel, so bad. I should never have told you to drop dead. And he'll feel bad, his anger will be appeased, his love will be earned, and maybe he'll give me a sandwich. That's the plan of the younger son. And he goes to his father. Father runs to him, receives him as his son. That's the whole point of the robe and the sandals and the ring on his finger. And the son begins to say that line. It's supposed to be like, I have sinned before heaven and earth. I'm not worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired hands. And he can't get to the last line. The father cuts him off. You will not shame yourself or debase yourself in front of me. I'm not going to make you work in the field like a slave to earn my love. Immediately, you're restored to full sonship. Okay. Rejoicing, killing of the fatted calf, dancing, drinking of wine. Older son, what the heck? I have slaved for you all these years. You haven't given my friends and I even a goat to celebrate with. Sometimes I'll do this story with the kids in the schools. What does the older son actually want? What does the older son actually want? And they'll say, well, the father's love and respect. It's like, no, not really. He says goat. He wants the fatted calf too. So he makes it out like, look at me. There's this son of yours. He's a jerk. I'm the good guy. No, you're both jerks. But that's the point of the story. Here's a father who is not fooled for a moment, but I accept my kids as they are, even as I call them to be something more. Now, going back to the Christopher West thing, what he says is, in a certain sense, the younger son represents the addict. I plunge myself in my passions, my desires. And maybe I encounter a certain despair because I realize that these things can't satisfy. Even if I have the abundance of wealth, pleasure, power, and honor, my heart is made for God. I still have the restless heart, which can't be satisfied by material things. On the other hand, the elder son represents the stoic. I believe that life is all about rules. Scribes and the Pharisees. You see this all the time. It's really easy to rip on the scribes and the Pharisees, but that particular approach to the faith is so attractive because it seems manageable and safe. It seems like the peak of evangelization is like getting people to go to Mass and saying their prayers. I'm biased because I'm a priest, but I think it's actually pretty easy to go to Mass and maintain a habit of prayer. It's harder to change your heart, even incrementally. It's harder to give your heart to Christ and go on this great adventure because I lose control. I have to surrender to something or someone who is bigger than myself. And that's scary. And so it's easier to show up at things and maintain habits of my own choosing. But more to the point, Christopher West talks about this. The addict and the stoic. And he quotes St. Augustine. St. Augustine says, "Those who are lost in their passions are less lost than those who have lost their passions." I'll say it again. Those who are lost in their passions are less lost than those who have lost their passion. It goes to the heart of Christianity. So many people think that the goal of Christianity is to feel nothing. I don't feel sad, I don't feel angry, I don't feel hurt, I don't feel pain. I feel nothing, which means I've abandoned my heart. I don't desire anything. I don't hope for anything. What do I love? What do I like? Nothing. And that's a saint. Gross. Now you look at the younger son, okay, clearly that's not good, but he's on to something. Because I had not abandoned my heart. And the thing which brings him back to Christ, the thing which brings him back to God the Father, is his desire for a sandwich. Because I haven't abandoned my heart, I come back to Christ. The example that comes to mind, I was listening to a testimony of this non-Catholic Christian, and she was talking about the family dog. And basically, the way she tells the story, the family dog died, and even though the dog was the family dog, the dog was actually her son's dog, and everyone knew it. The dog died when the son was at school. And then the son came back from school, and he had this intuition that the dog had died. And the dog was wrapped in a blanket. And the son ran to the blanket and tore off the blanket and hugged his dog who was dead. And he started praying to God, screaming to God, "God, God, if you're a good and loving God, breathe breath into my dog." Over and over again, just shouting at the top of his lungs. And the mother, just imagine the mother, right? She's just there, seeing her son in pain and agony and just crying out to the Lord. And she's praying about it, like, "God, I love my son. I hate to see him in so much pain. What can I do to alleviate his pain?" And the Lord was like, "Do not rob him of this moment. His dog has died, and he loves his dog, and he's mourning for his dog. Let him mourn. Don't circumvent that process because you're uncomfortable." So she let it play out. And again, he's crying out this prayer. And then once he let it all out, he was like, "Okay, let's bury the dog." A parallel thing, I remember watching this stand-up comedian. He was on this talk show. I think Conan O'Brien was the host. And he was talking about why he doesn't let his daughter have a cell phone. And he said, a lot of times what will happen is we're going through life, something triggers us, a certain emotional thing. And we don't like to feel uncomfortable emotions. And so what we do in those moments, I reach for the cell phone, or I do something worse, because I don't like feeling pain. And so he gave an example. He said, I remember I was driving down the road. All of a sudden I heard this old Bruce Springsteen song, and I started to feel sad, this nostalgic sadness. And at first I was going to reach for the cell phone, and I thought, no, don't do this. So I didn't, and then I cried, and I cried, and I cried. And all of a sudden, once all the tears were gone, all these positive antibodies came in, and I just felt amazing. And then Conan O'Brien was like, "What are you talking about?" I got to tell you, friends, if you remember that, that's going to change your life. The recurring temptation is like, okay, I kind of have some intuition as to this pain in my heart, and maybe even the reason why I feel this pain, but I can't go there. Because if I name these things, what does that mean for me? I'm going to be destroyed, but you won't. Now, here's the caveat. God's love tends to be incarnational. So if you're in your room and you're sad and you're journaling and you're like, okay, the reason why I'm sad is because of this, that might work. That has worked for me. But something which is really powerful is to go back to the time and attention thing. Who is it in my life who loves me? Who would be really helpful in this moment? It won't always be the same person, but God knows that you need friends. There's a passage in the Catechism of the Catholic Church which talks about this. I forget exactly where it is, but basically what it says is, just a paraphrase, if you go God's way, God will give you everything you need to become the person that He wants you to be. And then, surprisingly, the Catechism names all these things. They're very specific. It's not just like graces and blessings. It's like all these things. There's like 15 things. And one of them is friends. So that's really important, right? Even though there's this thing in my heart which is painful and maybe even a little bit shameful, who has God sent in my life where I can go to that place and cry and kick the wall or be upset and just play that thing out in its entirety where they'll be with me. Again, I'm with you. You can be in this space and I will not reject you. That is amazing. And the thing I want to impress upon you is that we all need that. We all need that. Like when I think about my time on internship, again, I needed every second of those conversations. And I still need it now. And when I think about the people in my life back then who helped me with that stuff, I have different people now, but again, the Lord knows you need friends. And so don't be afraid of that dynamic, but also realize it's a two-way street, you know? I need to have the courage to go to those wounded places in my heart, but also I need to be that quality of friend who's able to receive my brother or sister in the Lord. Really important stuff. Don't abandon your heart. Now, the next thing that Sherry Waddell talks about is this notion of spiritual seeking. And what she talks about here, she's like, spiritual seeking is kind of like intentional dating. So before, I needed to gain a sense of trust. Then I became curious. Then I'm open to the possibility of change. Now it's like, okay, I think I might consider possibly this whole discipleship thing. And you see this up and down the gospel. Just to focus on the example of Bartholomew. Remember how people come to him, we have found the Messiah. Where's he from? Nazareth. Can anything good come from Nazareth? It's something that we tend to forget when it comes to the disciples. For the longest time, I struggled with this notion of like, what does it mean to be a priest? A priest is old and white and fat. And so I was like, wait a minute. Similar thing with sainthood, right? What does it mean to be a saint? A saint is a stoic. Skewed notion of sainthood. But when you look at who Jesus calls, it's like, can anything good come from Nazareth? St. Peter, there's no fish in that lake. Right? Sons of thunder, let's destroy these people. That's the people the Lord picks. And why, right? They're passionate and they're honest. They're real and they're authentic. My favorite passage in the entire gospel is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 11, I believe, verse 28. When I was in Oshawa and I had that dual assignment, pastor and chaplain, I was like burning out. And I thought, you know what? I don't usually take a personal retreat, but I think I need one. So I went to Florida. I was really kind of brainstorming, like, what can I do to get back on track? Because this is a really important moment in my life. And what actually saved me was this particular passage. Come to me, all who are weary, and find life burdensome, and I'll give you rest. Learn from me, for I'm meek and humble of heart, for my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. First of all, this notion of like, come, right? Apparently, there's like some variation of like, do not be afraid in the Bible, like at least 365 times. One for every time of the year, and a couple more times just to drive the point home. It's consoling, but also humbling. The Lord's like, I know you're always freaking out, but don't worry, I am the Lord. So to get in the habit of that. But the other part of it, though, is, okay, come to me, all who are weary and find life burdensome, but also recognize the gift of my peace. It's both gift and task. Freely given, freely received, but at the same time, there's something you need to do to unlock the lock or unwrap the gifts. And what is that? Imitate my humility and imitate my meekness. So humility is not so much like I think badly of myself. Humility is like I think of myself less. Imagine you're a high-end basketball player, NBA. What are you thinking when you're playing the game? You're not thinking, boy, I hope I don't miss this shot. At the same time, you're not thinking, I'm totally going to make this shot because I'm awesome. You're not thinking at all. You're just playing the game. You're not self-conscious. You're not painfully watching yourself live life. More to the point is this notion of meekness. Meekness has nothing to do with social dexterity. It has nothing to do with being shy. Meekness, the best way to explain it, imagine you get like a wild horse, kicking up dust, kicking you in the face. Right? So a horse, which is not meek, has all sorts of energy and all sorts of strength, but no sense of discipline and focus, and therefore, in a certain sense, the horse is useless. The best way to frame it is all sorts of potential, but right now, kind of useless. What the horse needs, therefore, is to be meeked. All his strength, all his power, but everything focused. Now you hold that thought, you think about all the great saints in history. Think about St. Paul, think about St. Augustine, think about St. Peter. Pre-conversion, what were they like? So before, they were all over the place. St. Peter, really impulsive, cutting off that servant's ear. St. Augustine, fornication, that mistress. Think about St. Paul, killing Christians. Post-conversion, what happened? All their strength, all their power. Now everything is focused and disciplined. But here's the point. The raw material is, I'm passionate, I'm real, I'm authentic. I have not abandoned my heart. And that's a really good thing to keep in mind with regards to ministry. Not just as a priest, but for everyone else on the ground level. It's really important to tap into people's deep desires, to get them excited and passionate, and to never abandon their hearts. So maybe when you examine your heart, okay, here's these wonderful things which I like and I love, but maybe it's like, here's where I'm in pain. Here's where I'm sad. Here's where I'm struggling. Here's where I feel alone. I'm struggling with that. That's good too. Nothing can separate you from the love of Christ, so all of it is useful. All of it can be transformative and redemptive. But again, it requires us to journey inwards so that when we see it in other people, we recognize it and we know what to say and what to do because I've been to that journey myself. Now, the final thing is this notion of intentional discipleship. So the way that Sherry Waddell talks about this is the drop the nets moment. So I've gone through all the previous 4 steps. Now I'm ready to drop my nets and follow Christ. Now, the thing about this, it's the end of the journey, but in a certain sense, it's the beginning of the journey. Because when do the disciples drop their nets? At the beginning of the gospel. But then there's this whole passage where they journey with the Lord. They spend 3 years with the Lord in the context of the public life. And even after he comes back from the dead, there's this period of ongoing journeying, ongoing learning. Really important stuff. A lot of times we reduce the call to evangelization to, like, again, convincing people to go to Mass. I go to Mass, you don't go to Mass. Okay, now you go to Mass, now we're both at Mass, and we're good. Right? Mass is important. But at the same time, the journey of discipleship is a lifelong thing. A lot of times, I don't know about you, but when it comes to like Easter, I think a lot of times we arrive at Easter and we're like, thank goodness Lent is over. And it just seems like, okay, like Easter, the Lord has risen, and okay, what do you do with that? It's really important you pay attention to all these stories that you find post-resurrection. Mary Magdalene, St. Peter, St. Thomas. So just to pick one, just to focus on the example of St. Thomas. It's kind of funny because he's known as Doubting Thomas. Can't imagine that, eh? Throughout all Christendom, throughout history, it's like, that's the guy who doubted. Remember him? Yeah, that's embarrassing. But if you look at the story, there's a lot more to it. So basically what happens is the disciples are behind locked doors because of fear. They're afraid of the world, but also, we weren't heroic. Everyone ran away at the sight of the crucifixion, except for Mary and John and those women. And so we were with the Lord for 3 years. We failed him. He's dead. He was the embodiment of hope, and therefore hope in our hearts died with the death of the Messiah. That's like the starting point with regards to the story. And then Jesus comes. He walks through the locked doors, and he says, "Shalom, peace be with you." In other words, things are okay. Things are okay. Not because of anything you've done, because of everything I've done. Now, he has to say that multiple times because it's hard for people to grasp that reality. Love is freely given, freely received. Grace and mercy and forgiveness, freely given, freely received. But it is the case. Okay, fine. He eats some fish, good to go. He leaves. Thomas comes. How was your day? Well, we saw the Messiah. And he said things are fine. So things are fine. And he's like, I don't know, man. Now, it's easy to say, well, the reason why you say that is because you're doubting Thomas. No, you guys had the benefit of seeing the resurrected Christ, of talking with him. And at first, you didn't believe too. He had to convince you of the shalom thing. But here's me. My last memory of Christ was that he was seemingly destroyed by the forces of evil. And again, when he died, something in my heart died too. And so, forgive me if I don't believe you when you say that things are fine. It's a very important thing. It reflects the fact that there's often this tension between our intellectual faith and what our wounded hearts tell us. And given the option, what do we listen to? The question basically answers itself. It's hard not to listen to the wounded heart because it seems real, because it feels real. And what happens is Thomas is like, look, I will not believe until I see the mark of the nails, the mark in his hands, the mark in his side. Unless I could put my finger in those same marks, I will not believe. And the Lord comes. And he says, look, Thomas, look here. Look there. Put your finger here. Put your finger there. The thing to keep in mind, the story is tight because that's the nature of the narrative, but it's meant to reflect the spiritual journey. Lord, I want to believe in you. I want to trust in you. I want to give my heart completely to you, but there's the reality of my wounded heart. Is that okay? Prodigal son, I accept you and love you as you are, even as I call you to be something more. It's okay. I'll work through this wound and that wound, all your wounds, until you are fully healed and therefore fully alive. And that's why it's kind of interesting. You see how the story ends. Thomas says, my Lord and my God. That's the clearest articulation of the divinity of Christ on the lips of any disciple. And what's implied is that the reason why he was able to get to that point was because he had the courage and the generosity and the wherewithal to work through all his different wounds and not be thrown off by the fact that it's taking a long time. The Lord sees, he understands, and insofar as you have the courage, again, to work through these things, even though it's painful, even though it requires tremendous courage, it's not just good for you, it's good for the world.